So how Agile can cripple effective design work. I've done a lot of Agile coaching over the years. I come in, I work with teams at various companies and try and help them be successful in the work that they're doing. And what I often find is that while there's so much that's good about the Agile movement and what it's brought to software development compared to the work that I did in the 90s was very, very heavyweight in a lot of ways and very process heavy. And the pendulum, in a lot of ways, has swung away from that heavyweight kind of waterfall document-driven process, which is very refreshing. And yet I go in and I work with a lot of teams, and I find that these teams are still in a situation where they feel like they are serving the process rather than the process serving them. Does anyone ever feel like that, right? It's like, and that's not what process is about. A process is meant to serve us. It's not about serving the process. And so, and I'm using process in kind of a technical sense there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these main areas here. Firstly, the inevitability of design, and we'll dig into that. Some faulty assumptions that I think a lot of teams that are doing Agile have about design. The connection between agility and design work. And then what does design agility kind of look like? What does it mean to be adaptive in your design? And what are some techniques that can help with that? And then when I chose the catchphrase for my consulting company, I made it leading by design. And I chose that deliberately because I wanted people to understand that what I feel is important is that design can actually make you a leader in what you're doing. If you really understand design well, not only the process of design, but in terms of software design and the details of that, but also design as a discovery process, as a way of getting rid of the ignorance that you have when you start a project, then that can be a really powerful thing. So firstly, let's talk about the inevitability of design. So there's a great quote from Douglas Martin. On my blog at thepaulrayner.com, I started collecting quotes about design. And I really like this one because basically what he's saying is that whether you like it or not, you're doing design in your project. And whether or not you say you have time for design, you are doing design. A lot of teams I go in, I work with them. There's one team I worked with in New Jersey in the United States, and they said, we don't have time for design. We just always got to get the next feature done. You know, the Scrum Master won't give us any time to do design work. Well, what does this quote say? You are doing design work, you're just doing bad design work because you're not being intentional about it. You're not doing it in a sustainable way. And he went on to say that it's about making conscious decisions. It's about approaching the problem that you're trying to solve in a way that's intentional and saying, I'm trying to figure out how to structure this software in such a way that it has a fitness for purpose, that I understand what the purpose of the software is and how to structure that software, how to design it so that it meets some kind of human need. And then I love this quote from, this is a friend of mine, Venkat. Some of you may have heard him speak. And the idea is that, well, what do we mean by a good design? So a good design, there's this mistaken assumption that a good design is basically, I'm going to do a whole bunch of analysis and then I'm going to come up with this design that is as close to perfect as I can make it so that it doesn't need to change, and that's a good design. But what Venkat's saying in this quote is that kind of predictive approach to design is fundamentally flawed. And that good design is actually, it's adaptive. It's a design that allows you to be flexible where you need to be flexible. The terminology that Eric uses in the book is supple design. Design that is malleable where it needs to be malleable. Okay? And so with design, we're not trying to predict the future, we're trying to be adaptive in the right ways. And a big part of that, and I'll be talking about this later, is design is fundamentally iterative. So let's talk about some faulty assumptions that I've come across. I'm not saying that these necessarily apply to you or to everyone, but these are some of the ones that I've come across when I've worked with teams. So assumption number one, the product owner is the conduit for understanding business needs. Okay? So the idea here is for teams that maybe are doing Scrum is that there's a role called the product owner. And what a lot of teams end up doing as a technical team is they defer everything in terms of understanding the business to the product owner. Has anyone experienced this type of situation? Right. 10 years ago, when I was doing development before Scrum became popular, you just substitute the term business analyst instead of product owner, and it was the same problem. I worked with a team several years ago where they had a business analyst working with the team, and the team, I came and trained them in domain-driven design and then started coaching them. And this business analyst, she would not let the developers talk to the domain experts, to the business people. She's like, that's my job. You stay in the room, you write the code, and let me talk to the business. You know, and it's kind of like the it's kind of like the ferryman that rides, you know, that goes across the river to Hades, and you have to pay him some kind of money, and he'll take you across the river to Hades, and you can rescue a soul and bring them back. It's that kind of feel of, I need to be able to, I can't have a collaborative relationship with the business. So I see this kind of anti-pattern happening a lot with teams. Here's another assumption. Technical considerations, rather than business capabilities, drive design decisions. And this takes a lot of different forms. With some teams, this is what Jeff Atwell calls the magpie developer syndrome. So in Australia, we have a bird called a magpie that collects shiny objects, right, and puts them in its nest. I think there's something equivalent to that in Europe. And as developers, as technical people, and I'm guilty of this as well, sometimes we can be like that. It's like, what's the newest framework? What's the newest language? And that's what I want to do. We need to write a new web server, and oh my goodness, look, there's Elixir, and somebody's just written this thing called Phoenix. Let's do that, because I want to learn a functional language and I want to write it in Phoenix because that's the cool new thing. Or I'd really like to learn Redis, or I'd really like to learn Cassandra, whatever it happens to be. And have those kind of things drive design decisions. And then this one, I think, is a little bit more of a presupposition or maybe an underlying assumption that technical leadership and good design are not as important as process excellence. So most of what you'll hear about in the Agile community is an emphasis on process excellence. You know, how to get better at Scrum, how to have better user stories, how to manage your backlog better, how to groom your backlog, how to have a more efficient daily stand-up. Those are the kinds of things that you hear at Agile conferences. I know I'm a member of the organizing committee for an Agile conference in Denver in April, and it's very, very hard to find talks on topics other than process excellence. I think I have the only talk on the roster right now that talks about design. So there's this assumption that technical leadership and good design work are not as important as process excellence. And these make our job much harder if we care about design. And what's tended to happen in a lot of the Agile community is that they said, well, we don't want to do big design up front, so let's not do any design up front. Okay? We've said we need to incrementally build MVPs, minimum viable products, right? Because that's what the Lean Startup book tells us to do. And I'm a big fan of this idea of building minimum viable products, minimum marketable features. But what that's tended to do is to compromise our ability to have a cohesive product design. Fred Brooks, who wrote The Mythical Man Month years and years ago, if you have not read that book, you need to read that book, right? It's a classic in software development. It's just as relevant today as it was when it was first written. And he talks about one of the chief roles of a software designer is to have a cohesive design, a design that actually coheres, that makes sense, that has a conceptual integrity. Okay? So we want a product design that has a conceptual integrity. And I'll be talking about this a little later, but from a user experience perspective, we want it to have a perceptual integrity as well. When customers, when users interact with our software, they should perceive that it is a seamless experience. How about this one? What does the manifesto say? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, working software over comprehensive documentation. Somehow that got to, let's not write any documentation at all. I wrote a long blog post a few years ago on what I think about documentation, and then I've been very excited to see Cyril, who's going to be speaking later in the conference, talking about living documentation. I'd highly encourage you to catch up with him. He's got a book out on LeanPub about that. And then this one, the manifesto talks about customer collaboration, and yet I see a lot of teams take a very passive role and basically say, well, we're just going to delegate those kind of decisions to the product owner. So Douglas Martin goes on and says, well, we're all making design decisions all the time. We just don't realize that we're actually doing it. We're making trade-offs, and we can be conscious or unconscious about that. And then back in 2011, Mary Poppendick, who's been very active in the lean software development movement, talked about the problem with having amateur designers. And what she meant by that is that writing user stories is a design activity, is what she put in this article. Writing user stories is a design activity. Documenting requirements is a design activity, because you're making decisions, particularly the way most user stories or requirements are written, you're making decisions about language. You're making decisions about the interactions with the system. And what she says is that should be the responsibility of the people in the team that actually are good at design, and not necessarily the person that's just responsible for churning out user stories. This is a very famous moment. This was at the Olympics. This is the US relay team failing. 4 fastest runners in the world, but they failed. Why did they fail? You probably can only see it at the front of the room. Someone at the front of the room, why did they fail the relay? Yes, they dropped it. It's right here. Look at the look on his face. That's the... And software development is fundamentally, as Alistair Cockburn said, it's a cooperative game. It's a collaborative game. And we succeed or fail together on a software development team. And so every time we introduce some kind of handoff in terms of design, some kind of handoff where maybe somebody's writing the user stories and somebody else is responsible for coding them, and they're not collaborating closely with each other, you can have this kind of thing happen, where you're producing suboptimal results. Even if each person is actually very good at what they do, you can end up with an overall suboptimal result. So let's talk about design agility. What does that look like? What are some things that can help us with that? And I want to mention 4 main things. I've been teaching domain-driven design for 5 years now, and coaching teams in domain-driven design. And so I speak with a very strong DDD accent, right, when I talk about design. But I've also had the privilege of working with a lot of really good user experience designers, and I've also done a lot of work in the BDD community as well, behavior-driven development. And so I tend to bring a lot of that in as well. So I want to talk about 4 things. Knowing your core domain, which Eric mentioned in the keynote to a certain extent. Creating and enforcing software boundaries, the importance of ubiquitous language, and actually having your process be about design. Having design just be an integral part of what you do as an activity. So let's talk about that. I really think that this is a faulty assumption. And so what is this? Rosetta Stone in the British Museum. I've been into London several times and been able to see it. Well, you're on the other side of the security glass, but it's really cool. There's a Rosetta Stone basically allowed Antiquitas to be able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics for the very first time. Up until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, nobody could read Egyptian hieroglyphics. They had no idea what was written on the walls of the tombs in Egypt. And because they had Greek and they had demotic script, they were able to translate, because it's the same text in all three languages, they were able to translate and interpret hieroglyphics, and it opened up that whole field. And so the Rosetta Stone has kind of become a symbol of that notion of translation between different things. And what I often find now is that it's very tempting for someone on the team to become that team's Rosetta Stone, right? I mentioned this in the workshop over the past couple of days. I often found I would be in the role of lead developer or architect on a team or something like that, and I would have the business people coming to me and they would say, okay, here's what we're trying to do. I say, well, can't you just talk to the developers about that? And it's like, no, they're too busy coding and stuff like that. We'll just explain it to you and then you go talk to them. And then the developers would say, okay, well, we've implemented this, now you go explain that to the business people. And so I was being put in that role of translating. And the product owner often ends up in that role as well, but they shouldn't be. Like, the role of the product owner in the Scrum process is to help the team understand the business value of the features that they're delivering, to really understand what's important about this software, and to be the champion for the software. But not to tell the team how to write the software. That's their job to figure that out. They're not the gatekeeper to the experts in the business. They're not the conduit for understanding what the software needs to do. DDD emphasizes really strongly, along with user experience design and behavior-driven development, the importance of a collaborative role between the people that you're writing the software for and the non-technical people and the technical people. So don't be a Rosetta Stone on your team. Instead, build relationships and trust. Have people on the team work with people from the business and grow the ability to respect each other and bring the different abilities between the business customers, the domain experts, the technical experts. Get people on the team involved together in developing this thing. Let's talk a little bit about core domain. So Eric mentioned it briefly. The idea with core domain is thinking about what in this software actually contributes to the competitive advantage for your company. What is your secret sauce? And that might seem a little abstract, but I'll dig into that in a little bit. But the idea is, if you can figure that out, if you can figure out what the business goals are for the software, then write as little custom software as possible to accomplish that, to deliver that. Because every line of code you write, you have to maintain. And it's going to be there for potentially a long time. And not just you maintain it, but other people down the road. There's software that I wrote. I worked on a mind planning, mind modeling system from 1990 through to 1995 for a company called MapTech. So this software ran on Silicon Graphics workstations, and which were the highest end Unix workstations that you could get at the time. These were the same workstations that they would use to do special effects for movies like Jurassic Park. Okay, and I had one on my desk. And so we would use this software, and what they could do is they could actually bring up so this is 1992, 1993, they could bring up the entire pit design, like an open cut pit, and be able to rotate it around in real time in 3 dimensions and perform block modeling analysis and triangulation of data points and calculate areas and things like that. Incredible stuff. And I worked on one particular module for that. This was written in C and Fortran in roughly 1993 for geotechnical modeling. That software is still in production today, right? It's ported to the PC, it's still out there. What is this now, 2016? So there's probably some code that I wrote that someone's reading right now going, what was he thinking? Right? Code can be very long-lived. This is a helpful diagram. This is not from DDD. This is from a different book that I'll mention a little later. But it's called the Purpose Alignment Model. And it's one way of kind of getting your head around the idea of what do we mean by core domain. So think about all the things that your business does, all the different activities, and then grade them according to how mission critical are they, how important are they just to the general running of the business, And then how much do they contribute to your business's competitive advantage? How important are they in the marketplace? And the reality is that the vast majority of what your company does probably sits down here in the bottom right. Invoicing customers, just all the kinds of stuff that legal, compliance, just all the kinds of things that your company has to do. And really, for things in the bottom right, you just want parity. You're not trying to innovate or excel. You're not trying to be better than anybody else. You just need to do a good enough job. For things on the bottom left here, companies should be trying to minimize that stuff or just maintain it. You shouldn't be doing custom software development down here. Right? If you are, you might as well just be burning the money. Right? And over here on the right-hand side, we'll talk about this in a moment, but you have to be very, very careful with custom software development for things in the bottom right. So then the question becomes, well, what about things up in the top two quadrants where it really does contribute to your competitive advantage in the marketplace? And the reality is that if something is not only mission critical, but it's part of your competitive advantage, if it's a real market differentiator, then that's where you want to excel and innovate. That's where you want to be better than anyone else. In fact, that's where you probably aren't really sure if it's going to work or not. You might need to try a few things. Right? You need to do some experiments to find out. And you're blazing a trail. And then things that are less mission critical but still potentially differentiating are things where you would want to partner with another company. So an example of that might be a book publisher like Pearson Addison Wesley that publishes the domain-driven design book. They might want to branch into a new form of e-publishing or something like that. Rather than have that capacity in-house, they might partner with another company that's a specialist in that so that they can accomplish that without having to shift their central focus away from what they do well. Okay, so that's what we mean by partner. Now, in domain-driven design, Eric spends a lot of time in the book talking about what he calls domain distillation. This is in the fourth part of the book. Okay, domain distillation. And he basically describes domains as three different kinds, three different subtypes. So he talks about generic subdomains, supporting subdomains, and core domain. So a generic subdomain is anything your business does that all other businesses like yours do. Okay, so where would that land on here? Where do you think? Bottom right, exactly. So generic subdomains, bottom right, and perhaps extending over into here. Then he talks about supporting subdomains. So supporting subdomains is things that are specific to your business, and so you might have to write some custom software development, do some custom software development. But with supporting subdomains, what you're really trying to do is write enough software of good quality to be able to support your core domain. Okay? So supporting subdomains probably live somewhere down in there as well, but they're moving up towards that excel and innovate. And then core domain is going to be the smallest thing. Like this quadrant chart is not to scale. But core domain is going to be that small thing that involves excelling and innovating and enabling partnerships with other companies so that you can get ahead in the marketplace. And I found this tremendously helpful for thinking about this. So, for example, if you are working in a Scrum team and you have a product backlog, what you probably just see, well, I hope you're not unfortunate just to have a sea of Jira tasks. If that's your world, I'm sorry. Okay? But hopefully you have some way of thinking about what's the relative importance of these things and how do they contribute? Like, if I look at this set of features, are they part of our core domain? Do they support our core domain? Or are they part of a generic subdomain? If they're part of a generic subdomain, don't write custom software for them if you can avoid it. Just use an open source framework or some off-the-shelf software. It'll be faster and cheaper. Okay? If it's a supporting subdomain, that's a great candidate for outsourcing it to contractors. Focus your best designers, focus your best people, do your domain modeling in this area of complexity and uncertainty up in the top, your core domain. So when it comes to things, just practical things like a Scrum team that is doing sprint planning or getting ready for a sprint and they're estimating stories. your approach to estimation should be completely different depending on where that story sits, that feature sits in terms of your subdomains. If it's generic, just needs to be good enough. In fact, could we use something open source or off the shelf to enable this capability? If it's supporting, then, well, let's get one of the junior staff or contractors to work on that. We want good quality, we want it well tested, but we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or do something any better than anyone else. But if it's core domain and you're estimating stories, you should be saying, well, there's a lot of uncertainty around this, there's a lot of risk. Let's give ourselves more time to do this. And maybe we need to do a little bit of exploratory work to figure that out. Okay, so technical considerations or business capabilities. I'm firmly a believer in business capabilities, right? I don't care what kind of car or motorbike the delivery driver drives, so long as he gets me that pizza in the time frame that I would like, and that it tastes good and that my children are happy, right? So part of being able to deliver business capabilities is to understand what kind of playing field are you working in. So that purpose alignment model came out of this book, Stand Back and Deliver. It's a great read. Here's another 4-quadrant chart from that book in terms of thinking about your project playing field. What kind of project are you working on right now? Is it a project with a lot of complexity or not much complexity in terms of technical complexity, domain complexity? Where does it sit on that spectrum? And then what about uncertainty in terms of how well understood is what you're building? Is there a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the feature needs to look like? If it's low complexity, low uncertainty, in the book they call this kind of project a dog project. It's laissez-faire. It takes a lot less skill to be able to pull off a project in this kind of area. Nicely suited for outsourcing, for contracting. This is probably generic or supporting subdomain. When you have a lot of uncertainty but low complexity, and I think that's where a lot of Scrum projects sit well, is what they call a cult. You want a small team, you need an agility, a nice cohesive team, and you want to be able to move through that project fairly quickly and get it done. And you don't want to try and be too fancy in terms of technical complexity. And really, domain-driven design for these types of, for cult projects and dog projects, overkill, right? You're not doing the type of model exploration and discovery that I've been talking about. These types of projects are really good for using simpler frameworks like Active Record and other things like that, because there's a lot of uncertainty about how the software needs to work in terms of the features, but not about the technical side, or not a lot of complexity in the domain. Now, you also have projects that have a lot of complexity, but not much uncertainty. Not much uncertainty. So they call those a cow project, right? Has this kind of plodding kind of idea. They need well-defined interfaces, good project management. They need a lot of domain expertise, but there's not a huge amount of risk on these kind of projects, other than the risk of introducing additional complexity by going overboard with frameworks and technologies. But then you've got this fourth category of project space. Maybe this is where you find yourself. Are you on a bull project, right? High uncertainty, high degree of complexity in terms of domain. These ones need good management, good leadership, good technical leadership. This is where, domain-driven design can work very well down here in the bottom right if you've got a lot of domain complexity. But it works particularly well up in the top right here, where you've got a lot of domain complexity, where you've got a lot of uncertainty, you're trying to discover what it is that the project needs to do, and you're just trying to get all that under control. So I find this kind of way of compartmentalizing things very helpful, because it gives me a language of kind of thinking about it and talking with the business of, well, this is the kind of project that you're asking us to do, and so this is the environment, the playing field we find ourselves in, and so how are we going to handle that? What would be the appropriate approach? Okay, second part of design agility is thinking about modeling and design and thinking about boundaries. Identifying, creating, and enforcing software boundaries, particularly where you have a lot of domain complexity. I don't have time to, we just spent 2 days with a great group of people going through and explaining how to do context mapping. There's some great articles out there on how to do context mapping. But basically, Eric talked about the importance of having a model with a good boundary around it and understanding what that is. So here's an example of a context map where what we have up here is we have an AS400 system for managing claims, and it's a legacy system. It's very, very hard to make changes in there. It's almost impossible to do sophisticated design work. And so what domain-driven design says to do is, in a context map, draw a big line, draw a circle around it and label it as a big ball of mud, and don't try and do sophisticated design work inside that context. It's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to pull off. What you would need to do is to create a new context, in this case called warranty administration, that duplicates over time the critical core domain aspects of this legacy system, and then build what is marked here as an ACL, an anti-corruption layer. But basically an API that allows you to wall yourself off from that big ball of mud, because they have a tendency to sprawl, and be able to do the design work that you need to do. So this is all about saying, we've got this new context, we want to do some really supple design work here, and so we need to figure out what that model looks like, what its boundary is, and how we're going to interact with this upstream monolith that's going to overwhelm our design work if we let it. It's a little bit like this idea. So this is in the US. There's certain rivers in the United States that flood periodically, and this person wanted to do some fairly sophisticated design work. They wanted to have a nice house, some land. So they built an anti-corruption layer against the sprawling monolith. Okay, I'm stretching the metaphor, but you get the idea, right? So what we're talking about there is you need to, when you're working with these types of legacy systems, and you can read Martin Fowler's article on the strangler pattern if this is new to you, and that will help you understand some of this. And then Eric, on dddcommunity.org, Eric has a great series of videos talking about these different patterns for doing this when you have legacy systems. But the idea is, if you're trying to integrate with one of these big balls of mud, you need to put the work in to isolate yourself from that thing. I worked with an Agile team a few years ago, came in, they brought me in, I did a day's training, and then we were doing a workshop for a few days. And what they were trying to do was to take this server-based system and move it to the cloud and put it on the web so that people could access it. And so I asked them, well, have you budgeted any time to build the API to the back end? And it's like, oh, we'll deal with that when we get to it. Why aren't you thinking about that now? Isn't that a critical piece? Because doesn't the front end drive that back end, and isn't like, can you use the front end without the back end? Oh, no, it's all going to be fully integrated. Well, when are you doing the integration? Right at the end. Okay, well, what's problematic about that? They're giving the appearance throughout the entire project that they're delivering things, but they haven't delivered anything because nothing actually works, right? And what ended up happening on that project, and I said to them, you need to budget some time now to at least have an idea of what that API looks like, and to be able to maybe stub out that API and test again, have a nice test suite around that API, and be able to start integrating with that as early as you possibly can. They didn't listen. The project was months late. There was a lot of finger pointing, and it's what happens when you don't listen. Boundaries are fragile. somebody might say, well, we've got this one piece of data that we need to get from the legacy system. And so let's just go round the API for this one thing. And a little bit of water starts to leak into the house. Might not be so clear from the back, but we've got a problem, we've got a leak. And then the next developer comes along and says, well, I need to just get this one other thing. And pretty soon you don't have an anti-corruption layer anymore. You have to invest effort in doing these boundaries. This is design work. It may seem not very exciting design work, but this is design work because you want to avoid this kind of situation. Who wants to live in that house? You might feel like that's your code base right now. I'm trying to build this house. Keeps flooding. I wonder why. Boundaries take work. They take effort. Okay, technical leadership. Let's talk about technical leadership. What is leadership? I think that leadership is not about authority. Okay, a lot of people think that, well, I've been made the architect or I've been made the lead, the dev lead, so now I have the authority to tell people what to do. You're in for a rude shock. Leadership is about influence. It's about being able to get the respect of other people and have them respect your opinion because it comes from experience and because it's a collaborative kind of exercise. And so to have that kind of leadership, because doing this good design work is hard, but a leader, which I would hope that many of you aspire to design leadership in your teams if you're not doing that already. In good design work is hard, but you then have to socialize that design to the rest of the team to avoid the type of situation we had where the boundary gets broken because one person doesn't understand why it's important. The way I like to define technical leadership is this way. The job of a technical leader, a dev lead or a system architect, whatever that is that your team falls into technical success, right? You provide an environment, a technical environment for the team where they can make the right decisions by default without having to think about them. So in domain-driven design terms, if you're familiar with that, it's socializing what are value objects, what are aggregates, what are these building block patterns, what are these technical things, and how do they work, and what does that look like in the code so that everybody understands why it's important. And like I said, it's about influence, not authority. Many people read the 4 principles for the Agile Manifesto, but or the 4 values, but they don't actually read the 12 principles on the second page. But I'm a firm believer in this, that we want technical excellence and we want good design, and that actually enhances agility. Eric said this, the most significant complexity of many applications, it's not technical, it's in the, anyone? Domain itself, right? The activity or business of the user. That's why it's called domain-driven design and not technical-driven design or framework-driven design. It starts with the business domain because that's where the complexity is. And then he went on to say a successful design has to deal with this business domain complexity. And as he put it as the title of his talk this morning, making that in the heart of the software. So how do we do this? Well, this involves understanding the business language. It starts with what domain-driven design calls ubiquitous language, learning to speak the language of the business domain and investing the time to do that. So I gave this example in the workshop. I've changed the names for this, but this is a real email exchange on a project I was involved with back in 2006, where Pam, the accountant, sent an email to John, the AS400 developer, asking about this very simple idea of retail price. And John came back with a perfectly correct but completely unhelpful answer, which Pam was very upset about. And so she wrote an email to Claire, the business analyst, expressing how upset she was about that. But even then, she was trying to find some common ground with John, the developer, and Claire tried to help out. Does this seem like ubiquitous language? It's the antithesis of that, right? It really is.
Well,
This,
at least everybody did understand those swearing words.
yeah, everyone understood that. Well, actually, it had the real word in there. I edited that. But you understand it, and that's the important thing. You can interpret that in whatever language you want, and it's universal. So what we're talking here about is speaking a common ubiquitous language. You know, ubiquitous is just a fancy word for common, or a lingua franca, a common shared language between the business and the technical team. And it's not just the business team not just the technical people going to the business saying, tell us all your terminology, and we'll write it down and put it in the code. Right? Does that sound like collaboration? Not so much, right? It's working together to flesh that out. So in this case here, I've given some examples of something we used in the workshop, the idea of limit of liability on an insurance contract. So I've got the legal definition. I've got a cartoon that was drawn by someone in the business explaining how limit of liability works as a shield. The liabilities are unable to get through. We've got people on the team talking about limit of liability, and we've got the actual method called limit of liability that goes through and aggregates the claim amount for the total claim amount, compares that to the purchase price less 20%. Okay, ubiquitous language. It's in the code, it's in the conversation, it's on the wiki. Everyone understands what it means. Related to this is the idea of a reference scenario. What do we mean by a reference scenario? So, domain-driven design doesn't start with an abstract model. It starts with a concrete business problem, a specific concrete business problem. Because like Eric said, it's not about realism. What's it about? Usefulness, right? So, walking through a specific business problem. I think that those that came to the workshop over the last 2 days were maybe surprised with how specific I mean by specific, right? Yeah. So we're probably familiar with a lot of these books. TDD talks about 3 steps in writing any piece of production code. Write a failing test, make it pass, have a coffee, write a failing test, make it pass, have a coffee, right? Is that the TDD cycle? If you do it that way, you're actually missing the design step. So refactoring is formally defined as improving the design of the system without changing the behavior, right? So it's micro design. Refactoring, if you're doing it as a continuous process, is micro design. You're making very small steps along the way. And you're making it part of what you're doing. What domain-driven design emphasizes is not so much that micro design, but the concepts. If you can introduce a new concept like limit of liability that wasn't in the code before, that's not an emergent concept from the code. That's a concept that you've modeled from the business. And it's I believe it's 100 times more powerful than an emergent concept in the code, because it can transform the whole nature of the code in ways that you would not expect, which is part of why I find DDD so fun. So the fourth thing, 4 of 4, is baking design into your process. Okay, I want you to think about this. So Scrum, who's following Scrum? Most people? What else are people doing? Kanban? XP? There's always one person doing XP. One faithful, all the practices? Nice. Rachel Davies gave a great talk last year. I think it was at QCup or the DDD Exchange on taking extreme programming to the next level. So that's worth watching. But that's not part of this talk. But Scrum doesn't really say all that much about how to do the work, and yet people tend to think of, when you say, well, what process do you follow? Well, we say, well, we follow Scrum. We're doing Scrum. Well, actually, you're not doing Scrum. Scrum is just a description of how you're arranging your activities as a team, right? Scrum doesn't say anything about how to actually do the work, right? It's just a way of organizing a team with a few ceremonies and artifacts to say, well, here's how you can structure things in such a way that you can actually accomplish some work on a regular basis. And hopefully it's potentially shippable at the end of the sprint. I really believe that Agile is not the work, right? Design is the work, right? Development is the work. That's what we're actually doing. Design is a key part of what we do. It's an integral part of what we do. Most teams that I go into, I'll walk into their team area and I'll see on the wall maybe a task board and some metrics and maybe a burn down chart, and I'll say, well, what kind of domain are you working in? Oh, it's really complex business domain, lots of problems to solve. Okay, great. And I look around, like, where's your sketches of the model? Where do you talk about design? Oh, we don't have time for that. We seem to have time to put all these other charts up. Okay, I'm getting a little cynical. Moving on. So the idea here is, that was the one rant, okay? So when you have that intersection of market differentiating and mission critical, and you have a lot of domain complexity, that's when you're in the realm of core domain, and that's the sweet spot for DDD. Okay, I'm not saying that aspects of DDD like ubiquitous language and collaborative modeling and just using things like aggregates and building blocks are not applicable when you don't have those three things. But bringing all of DDD together really works well there. And if you don't take that into account, if you don't deal with that domain complexity, what tends to happen over time with any system is, yes, you can incrementally deliver value, but soon you reach the point where your design can no longer support the types of features that you need to deliver, and your ability to deliver value over time diminishes. And then people start calling for a rewrite. Okay, can't work with this system anymore, it's too slow for everyone to get stuff done. And so that central place really is the sweet spot for domain-driven design. So I'm not going to talk much about this. Eric wrote a paper. You can Google or you can look for it, domainlanguage.com/DDD/Whirlpool. But the basic idea is, he gave a talk about 5 years ago on folding Agile and design. And the idea that when you're doing domain-driven design, there's this kind of cyclical, iterative process of you can start anywhere, but you've got a concrete business scenario, for example, and you create a model, a mental model of how might we address that? What are the concepts? And then you run another scenario past it and you see, well, that breaks my model, so I need to tweak my model. And you're going through this iterative kind of process of refining your model, breaking your model, fixing it, transforming it. And then at some point, writing a bit of code, maybe some tests, making some assertions, coding up some classes, objects, to add some rigor to that model and see what else breaks and what you need to tweak. And what I find is when I work with teams that integrate that kind of approach of iterative design into their process, what tends to happen over time is that they reach a point where they say, well, I need to do a little bit more modeling. So they run through the whirlpool again and they tweak the code and they introduce a new concept like limit of liability, and the value goes up. And then they reach another point where they're like, this concept is not in the code, we don't know how to do this. And so they run through the whirlpool again. And over time they keep doing this. And then they reach a point maybe where, and this happened on a project several years ago that I remember vividly. It was right near the end of the project, and it was about to go through stress testing and into production, and they realized that one of the fundamental concepts on the way that they designed it just didn't work. But they'd been applying DDD throughout the course of the project, and so over the course of a day, I sat down with the dev lead and we pair programmed out, we whiteboarded out some options and talked it over with the domain expert, and came up with something. It was like, wow, this could really make a difference. I think we've really captured what the business is trying to do here. So we pulled a few more domain experts in, and they looked at it and said, well, aren't we doing that already? That's obvious. And we're like, no. Duh. So that day we did a code probe of like, okay, let's see what this looks like. And it worked. And so the following Monday, he finished that off and productionized it, and it really was the kind of situation where we saw a huge breakthrough in the way the software works. And it was very late in the project. And I see this kind of pattern with teams that are doing domain-driven design, is when you have that ubiquitous language and that supple design, you're able to do this kind of thing. Not always, but when you have that kind of assumption-breaking moment that transforms your model, you can really have a breakthrough happen and be able to deliver a lot more value, and then it may just taper off again. The idea is that we're going for a dramatic increase in domain knowledge. Here in a project, you have the least amount of domain knowledge, right? Dan Norther talks about deliberate discovery, and you'll probably hear Liz Keogh talk about that too. Process of deliberate discovery, being intentional about discovering things. So it's combining that incremental development that Scrum talks about with iterative design, and not just saying design pays off in the long run. I think it does, but I think what continuous attention to design can do is actually accelerate delivery in the mid to short term as well. So I just want to talk about a few things, a few practical things. I like to run design workshops with teams. I believe that designers really need to know your business domain. You need to understand the specifics of what you're trying to solve. It's not just enough to be good at Redis and PHP and C# and Java or Elixir, Ruby, whatever the language happens to be. Like Eric said, that kind of technical mastery is knowing the tools and being good with the tools, and that's important. But DDD says we need to up our game and move on to actually understanding what the domain is trying to do so that we avoid leaky abstractions, right? Okay, I'm going to skip. So I want to talk about a couple of related disciplines to DDD. One is user experience design. So DDD, if you think about an iceberg, how much do they typically say of an iceberg you can actually see above the waterline? 10%. What percent? 10. 10? Yeah, some people say an eighth. It's not much, right? And then the bulk of the iceberg is hidden. Didn't really help the Titanic either way. They probably should have seen the 10%. User experience design is concerned primarily with what? The visible part of the iceberg. And the way I think about domain-driven design is it's concerned with everything below the waterline, right? That conceptual model that underlies that and all the systems that have to interact and the context that have to interact to produce that. I'm just going to recommend a couple of books that you read. I wrote on my blog a nice summary of lean user experience, but if you're interested in how do you integrate user experience design into your process, this is the book to read by Jeff and Josh, Lean User Experience. I'll put these slides on later so you have access to those. Another great book that just came out last year is the Design Studio Method, and there's a lot in this book that's applicable to how you do domain-driven design as well in terms of how you approach design. Another technique from the behavior-driven development folks, particularly Matt Wynn, is the idea of example mapping. Who does backlog grooming? Does anyone do backlog grooming? Don't you just want to kill yourself in those backlog grooming meetings? Is it mostly just about estimating stories? Yeah, make it stop, right? So example mapping is basically saying, we've got this feature to work on, process refunds, and so let's talk about examples of how we would process refunds. So what do we do, for example, when a customer has a receipt and it's within a limit? That would be one example, and let's talk about that. And then let's mark that one in green. And then what would be the rule for that? Well, a customer must have a receipt. And then we have this other rule of a 14-day limit. So let's put the rules in blue. And so the idea is in 15 to 20 minutes, you take a story and you try and figure out what are the examples? How should it work? And this is a collaborative thing that the team does together with the business people or with the product owner. And then the output from that, you then take away and do what you need to do to get that into your software. If you have questions, they go on a red or a pink card. So in this case, what if proof of purchase is a bank statement? So if you do an example mapping session and you get to the end and you find you've got mostly pink stickies or mostly red cards, you're not ready to work on that thing yet because you don't have enough knowledge. Okay, so I just want to end with a couple of ideas. A lot of people, like you said, you feel like you're serving the process. And what can happen is that the process can smother good design work. Now, Fred Brooks, like I mentioned before, who wrote the Mythical Man Month, this is out of a more recent book called The Design of Design. It's a book about recursion. No, it's not really. Wow, no one laughed. Tough crowd. Okay, so he basically says you've got to hold off design, or hold off process, and by that he means the formal aspects of it long enough so that you can do that design work. So the sentiment there is that process can get in the way sometimes of figuring out not only design as a discovery activity, but also design as how do we actually implement this. So I'll let you read this one. This is a little cartoon I did last year. And what happened was I worked with a team. They just come off a 2-week project inception. And most of that project inception was basically like a 2-week backlog grooming meeting where they were just estimating stories. And the conversation went a little bit like this. You know, there's this notion that the design will just emerge, but apparently you need to invest a huge amount of effort in figuring out what the requirements are. Okay, so I just want to close with this, that the opportunity we have as software designers is to learn to handle the complexity, right, in a complex domain, and not to shy away from it. And that our job, and I want to leave you with this as kind of an inspiring quote, is that our job is to try and take these complicated things in the business domain and through modeling, make them simple, okay, and express that in the code. So, you want to take a photo?
Yeah,
all right.